Henry VIII, King of England. He's the man we all know from the textbooks, the one with 6 wives, the one who created the Church of England. But what if I told you there's more to his story? Much more in the halls of power. Henry VIII was feared and adored, but in the dark corners of his mind, something twisted and dark began to take over. What you might not know is that the king who once ruled an empire was slowly being consumed by paranoia, a paranoia that turned his own court into a living nightmare. And in the end, his body betrayed him, just as he betrayed everyone who crossed his path. What if I told you that the most powerful man in England, who ruled with absolute authority, died in a way so grotesque that his very corpse caused chaos, even in death? At the height of his reign, Henry VIII was larger than life. His court glittered with wealth, power, and splendor. But beneath the surface, a king with a god complex was slowly unraveling. And it wasn't just the people around him who paid the price for his paranoia and cruelty. No, it was his own body that would turn against him. The excesses of Henry's life were legendary. His gluttony knew no bounds. But his paranoia grew just as fast, and it led to some of the darkest chapters in English history. By the time he died, Henry VIII had become a prisoner of his own body, a man so out of control, so overwhelmed by his own fears and indulgences, that he couldn't even move without help. But it wasn't just his body failing him. His entire kingdom had become a kingdom of fear, built on suspicion, secrets, and manipulation. Spies watched spies. His court became a psychological battlefield, and even his own family was in safe from his paranoid grip. Henry was so terrified of betrayal, so consumed by fear, that he had spies watching even his own daughters. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth weren't just royal heirs to the throne. They were suspects in a kingdom of paranoia. Imagine living in that world, where every word you speak could mean your death. A world where loyalty was a commodity you could never be sure you had. Henry's court became a kingdom where trust was the greatest betrayal. And then there was the food. Yes, food, but not for nourishment. No, Henry's obsession with food was rooted in something darker, something deadly. Imagine a king so afraid of being poisoned that even the simple act of eating became a battle for survival. Food tasters, secret kitchens, guards around every corner. Henry didn't just eat, he performed, but at what cost? In the final years of his life, Henry VIII was a grotesque shell of the man he once was. His legs rotting, his body bloated, his mind lost in paranoia and decay. Unable to walk, he was carried like a king in exile. But even in his grotesque state, he still ruled, with an iron fist and a terrified mind. So what was the true legacy of Henry VIII? Not just a king with 6 wives, not just a man who split England from the Catholic Church, but a ruler who turned his own empire into a house of horrors. And that, my friends, is just the beginning of the twisted story of Henry VIII. Imagine living in a kingdom where every shadow could hide a betrayer, every glance, a threat, and every word you spoke could cost you your life. Henry VIII was a king who ruled not only with power, but with a terrible, suffocating fear. He was the master of England, but inside his mind, he was a prisoner. At first glance, Henry's court seemed like a realm of grandeur and opulence, but beneath the surface was a kingdom rotting from within, poisoned by suspicion, manipulation, and the creeping rot of paranoia. But loyalty had a price. For Henry, it was never enough to be surrounded by the faithful. He needed to be certain. It was as if he feared the very people who loved him. Every conversation was a potential plot. Every glance could be a sign of treason. His court became a web of distrust, and his fear of betrayal became all-consuming. He couldn't even trust his own daughters, the heirs to the throne. His fear was so intense that it turned his court into a paranoid maze, where everyone was suspect. To Henry, no one was above suspicion, not even the mother of his future heirs. One by one, they were caught in his net of fear, only to face the most brutal consequences. Anne Boleyn, once queen, was executed, accused of treason and adultery, charges likely fabricated by a man terrified of being deceived. Friends became enemies, and even the slightest gesture could be misinterpreted as betrayal. Henry's early years as king were marked by confidence, but as the years went on, a darker side of him began to emerge. He had men listening to every conversation, reporting every slight, every whisper of rebellion. In his mind, even the smallest rebellion could unravel his reign. Henry was so obsessed with controlling every aspect of his life that he destroyed the very people who helped him build his empire. It was said that even his closest allies began to fear him. The man who once ruled with absolute power was now a shadow of his former self, ruled by the very fear he had instilled in others. How long would it take before his paranoia consumed even the throne itself? One false move, one wrong look, and they could find themselves in the Tower of London, awaiting execution. One by one, Henry's trusted servants were replaced by men loyal only to him. He created a network of spies, secret agents planted throughout his court, watching everyone, including his own family. Henry's paranoia was not confined to the walls of his palace. It spread throughout his kingdom, infecting the people closest to him. His body was failing him, but his mind was sharp, constantly searching for threats, real or imagined. His reign, once marked by grandeur, became a reign of fear, a kingdom built on suspicion. His two daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, were at the very heart of his anxiety. While they were raised to inherit his crown, they were also viewed as threats, potential rivals who could one day challenge his rule. Henry watched them all, but it wasn't just his daughters who became pawns in his game of paranoia. His wives, all 6 of them, were forced to navigate a kingdom where loyalty was constantly questioned, where love could turn into suspicion with the flick of a royal finger. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had once captured his heart, was soon caught in the whirlwind of Henry's insecurities. In Henry's court, no one was safe. Not his closest advisors, not his family, and certainly not his wives. Her death was the result of a king who had lost touch with reality. The king's spies were everywhere. No one could escape the watchful eyes of Henry's secret network. The paranoia extended even to his most trusted servants. It's said that even those closest to him began to feel the weight of his suspicions. By the time Henry reached his later years, his paranoia had only deepened. Henry's paranoia was no longer confined to his court. It seeped into every corner of his kingdom. And as his mind twisted further, so did his kingdom. You might think gluttony is just an indulgence, a luxury of kings. But in Henry VIII's world, food was no longer just survival. He hunted, jousted, and ruled with flair. But with power came indulgence, and with indulgence came appetite. By the time his body began to rot from the inside out, Henry wasn't just eating. Dozens of cooks prepared hundreds of dishes a day, often serving him more than 10 courses. Each one lavish, rich, dripping in grease and game fat, roasted swan, buttered peacock, veal soaked in wine, giant pies stuffed with live birds. It became obsession, control, ritual, and eventually, his ruin. He didn't start this way. In his youth, Henry was tall, lean, and built like a warrior. He was consuming everything in sight: food, power, and eventually, himself. The kitchens of Henry's court were no less than a military operation. He was often lifted by pulley systems to sit, to eat, to move. Swan meat would bring him grace. Oysters, virility, venison, strength. These weren't meals anymore. They were magical spells, rituals designed to slow down the inevitable death. But the meals never stopped. In fact, they grew more elaborate, more grotesque. His breath, heavy. His appetite, still monstrous. And what began as indulgence ended as ritual, self-destruction. No one entered or exited without inspection. Spies even mingled among kitchen staff, just in case someone got too close to a dish. Eating became grotesque. But to Henry, it was power. If he couldn't rule by strength anymore, he would rule through spectacle. By the end of his life, Henry weighed nearly 400 pounds. His legs ulcerated from pressure. His mobility collapsed. And still, he demanded the feast continue. But this wasn't about hunger. It was about power, a display of dominance over nature and man. Every meal was a theatrical ritual, one that reminded everyone, this man could eat what you could never afford to smell. But beneath the golden goblets and spiced meats was something far more disturbing. His food wasn't just guarded. It was watched, prayed over, treated like sacred cargo. Because in Henry's mind, a poisoned oyster or foul wine wasn't just a risk. It was a political assassination waiting to happen. Henry's obsession with being poisoned grew so strong that he appointed official food tasters, shadowed his cooks, and had every dish scrutinized before it touched his plate. Even the act of eating became an exercise in distrust. His paranoia reached absurd heights. Kitchens were redesigned with secret entryways. Meanwhile, his body was swelling, his weight ballooned, his face puffed with drink. He could barely stand. He couldn't ride. You see, Henry believed in the mystical power of food, but nothing could stop what was coming. Henry's own body was now a battlefield. His legs, constantly wrapped to hide the stench. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the stench in the dining halls, the pus leaking from his wounds, the way he coughed through meals. And as he fed, England starved. In his final days, Henry VIII became a monster of his own making, not just a tyrant to his people, but a slave to his own obsession. What does it mean to die while still alive? To rot from the inside, trapped in a royal body. This is the story of a king whose body decayed before the crown left his head. The final years of Henry VIII were not just tragic, they were monstrous. Once a symbol of virility and strength, he had become a prisoner of his own flesh. Obese, ulcered, diseased. The smell, reportedly unbearable, clung to him like death itself. Special chairs were designed to haul his frame between rooms. His own body had become his cage. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his bloated limbs. By the 1540s, Henry was no longer the fierce warrior of his youth. His legs were ravaged by open ulcers, wounds that never healed. He could no longer walk. His immense weight, over 390 pounds, made him immobile. Poultices, bleeding, even cauterization, all useless against the king, whose body had declared war on itself. There are accounts suggesting that his wounds oozed continuously, sometimes so badly that his bedding needed changing multiple times a night. A king clawing at life, while death slowly devoured him. One ulcer, one gasp at a time, and inside, the king was dying. Slowly, painfully, and perhaps worst of all, pathetically. He began hallucinating, speaking to ghosts, raving about enemies, real and imagined, his once mighty voice reduced to mutters and groans. The same man who once jousted and danced was now reduced to groaning in his chambers, barely able to stand, plagued by infections that festered beneath layers of rotting flesh, even rotting in silence. Henry VIII commanded loyalty and fear. His temper, unpredictable. His paranoia, peaking. His body was so swollen, so decomposed, that what came next would enter legend. His mood could turn violent in a heartbeat. His physicians tried everything, and yet the world still feared him. Even his coffin, and we'll get to that horror, it had be specially designed. To speak of it, to admit the king was dying, was to risk your head. No one dared mention his condition aloud. His decay was the kingdom's open secret. Custom robes were required to dress him, beds reinforced, thrones widened. What must it have been like to be the most powerful man in England and see only ruin staring back at you? He still demanded feasts, still wore the crown, but his appetite had shifted from food to survival. Toward the end, his chamber doors were kept shut more often. His moans could be heard through the thick walls. His breath grew heavy, his mind clouded. By the time death came in, January 1547, Henry VIII was more corpse than king. The coffin, the explosion, the dogs, but we're not there yet, not quite. The king is dead. After nearly 4 decades of rule, Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in Europe, has finally drawn his last breath. Because what happened next is one of the most grotesque, horrifying, and whispered about moments in royal history, was rapid. But even in death, Henry refused to go quietly. His body, bloated and infected, lay still. But it would not stay still for long. Swelling, expanding, gases built up inside his corpse, a byproduct of death and decay accelerated by years of infection, obesity, and disease. His body was enormous, almost 400 pounds, covered in sores and rotting ulcers. The stench began immediately, and the decay, the coffin sealed tight and held together with bolts and prayers, ruptured. It was described by some as an eruption, by others as divine justice. Whether true or not, the story spread like wildfire. The king's corpse, so decayed, so volatile, that even in death, it could not be contained. There were strict instructions. His coffin was to be sealed fast and reinforced with thick sheets of lead. But even that wasn't enough. But there were no public tears, no grand eulogies, just the heavy silence of a kingdom that had lived too long under fear. As the procession moved across the cold countryside, Henry's bloated remains began to shift, or simply the tragic collapse of a man who believed himself untouchable. It still echoes through history like the boom of a cannon. At one stop along the way, St. George's Chapel, the unthinkable happened. According to eyewitness accounts, the pressure built up inside his body exploded outward, leaking through the coffin, staining the floor beneath. Legend has it that dogs were seen licking the blood that seeped out. And now, the king reduced to a grotesque warning, a bloated, ruptured relic of tyranny. The human body, especially one in Henry's state, swells dramatically after death. Gas builds rapidly when there are untreated infections. Combine that with a sealed coffin and no embalming. Clergy present at the time were said to interpret the explosion as a sign from God, a symbol of judgment, punishment for a life of excess, cruelty, and sin. 6 wives, 2 executed, close friends beheaded, thousands slaughtered in his name, a church torn apart to serve his pride. From a medical perspective, it makes sense. And yes, the body can indeed explode. He was buried at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he claimed to have truly loved. Henry VIII didn't just die, he detonated, and in doing so, he left behind a story so gruesome, so unforgettable. In life, he ruled with terror. In death, he exploded with it. But was it really divine judgment?